And welcome back. In Tucson, Arizona, a Superfund site from the post-war era has irreversibly impacted our aquifer, significantly affecting the nearby Mexican-American community. Our next guest guides us through her book, Exploring It, Concept of a Disabled Ecology, where human and natural vulnerabilities intertwine amidst ecological degradation. Here now to join us is the author of Disabled Ecologies, Lessons from a Wounded Desert, Sunaura Taylor. And Sunaura, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Darren. I'm really excited to be here and just really love the whole concept of your show. So thank you.
No, thank you. It's a great opportunity to really talk and discuss. And when we talk about this here, disabled ecologies, want to talk a little bit about that. Break it down for us for somebody who may not be so familiar.
Absolutely. Okay, so maybe the best way for me to sort of start introducing people to the concept is actually with my own personal story. So I was born disabled and raised with the understanding that my disability emerged from or was caused by contamination on the south side of Tucson, defense industry contamination from Hughes aircraft, which then became Raytheon. Um, and so, I've always been curious about what happened. We moved away when I was quite young. And so I wanted to better understand this contamination and this history. But also, having this sort of origin story really helped me think about disability and environment in particular ways. So, from a really young age, I understood that disability was something that wasn't just a personal problem, right? That is a problem that is, excuse me, that's something that is caused by and can be caused by, social inequality, pollution, war, environmental racism. And I also had an understanding that nature, right, isn't something separate from us. That human beings can be harmed, of course, by the same things that are harming nature. And so it's really those concepts that I'm exploring in this book. Um, so I went back to Tucson, moved back to Tucson with my family, and really wanted to better understand what had happened. And I found that sort of following the various trails of disability was one way of doing that. So the disablement that impacted the human beings and community who were impacted, right? As you said in your intro, largely Mexican American community, the illnesses and impairments that impacted the 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 wildlife, the ecosystems, those, and so a disabled ecology to me is almost a way of mapping that kind of human and non-human injury that can emerge from these sites of harm.
Yeah, and you broke down the definition in a great way because I think now we have a better understanding about it. But take us to Tucson and
Yeah.
take us there because we have this community in Tucson, Arizona, and you have the contamination of the aquifer. What can you tell us about this and how this really all played out?
Absolutely. One of the things that I was so surprised to find, right? My family had a lot of privilege. We were white, we were upwardly mobile. So we moved once from that neighborhood. Once, we found out that there was contamination. My parents moved. I was, of course, only very young. And so I didn't grow up with with this sort of sense of what was actually happening there. And when I moved back to Tucson, what I found, which was so amazing to me, was that there was a whole incredible environmental justice movement that emerged in response to the contamination, and in fact, it was one of the earliest environmental justice movements in the country. So they formed in 1985. So what happened essentially is that there was, all sorts of aircraft industry that had moved into Tucson in the post-war era. And they just started, essentially dumping their toxic chemicals onto the desert ground in, along fences and desert washes. And then eventually Hughes aircraft built these huge lagoons, but they weren't lined. They didn't put any sort of lining, and they dumped their contaminants in there. And so, of course, what's going to happen? is, those contaminants are going to sink into the desert ground and eventually reach Tucson's groundwater. And that groundwater, made its way into the drinking water of the community. Like so many other cases of environmental racism, what was really, also, so horrendous was the response of city officials who, even once they learned of, that certain wells were contaminated, they didn't do the work to figure out who potentially had been drinking that water. Once it really came to public light, thanks to community organizing and a really amazing investigative journalist, Jane Kay, then the city officials, essentially blamed the community, saying that they were already predisposed to illness or were sick because of their lifestyle, right? These extremely racist and ableist kind of ways, accusations, and kind of ways of dismissing the community's concerns.
Yeah, and Sonora, one thing to mention is you have a Mexican American population that actually lives right above this here, and so
Yes.
how are they impacted by this?
Yeah, so they were the most impacted, right? They drank this water, they bathed in this water, they played in this water. I have a lot of the people who I spoke to, who, of course, this was the 80s, and so a lot of them are retired in their kind of retired years now. And they remember being children, just playing in the desert washes, having no idea that there were tons of contaminants coming through. So people experienced a variety of cancers, of different, significant illnesses and diseases, lupus. There was really particularly really high rates of testicular cancer, but a whole variety of conditions. And that was actually part of it was kind of used against the community that there was such a broad range of illnesses and birth issues that emerged from this contamination, because the polluters essentially said that, oh, all of these conditions can't be caused by this by this one contamination, source of contamination, but of course they could be. So
Yeah, and when we talk about this, I understand that this is prevalent in areas where there's little to no voices that are really speaking up and speaking out. I'm reminded of Flint, Michigan. I've done
absolutely.
extensive work there, and these sound synonymous, right?
Yeah.
What can we do as a community? Because while we're talking Tucson, Arizona, there's Flint, Michigan. You got parts of New York. I can take you to upstate New York. I can take you even downstate, where there's questions and concerns that that arise on the similar side of this. What can we do to be more hyper vigilant on this?
It's so agonizing, because one of the reasons why I actually decided to investigate in Tucson is not only because of my personal connection to it, but on one level because it's so typical, right? You're totally right that these sorts of stories are all over, where I am too, in the Bay Area. And so, what I find so sort of hopeful is the amazing organizing that comes out of these communities. So Tucsonans for a Clean Environment, which was the group that emerged in response to this contamination, they had this really radical, expansive vision of justice that I think that we can all learn from, and that, again, I think is actually a lot of communities fighting these kinds of issues have a similar kind of a vision, and a lot that we can learn from, and sort of what they're calling for, right? So, a call for the polluters to be held to account, a call for there to really be a grappling with the racism and class inequality that leads to these neighborhoods and communities being kind of seen as sacrifice zones in the first place. A call for the landscapes that are impacted to be treated with care, and of course a call for community members to also receive care and treatment, right? To also not be left decades later still dealing with their illnesses and conditions without without kind of healthcare, right? So I think that in terms of what can be done beforehand, I think that we all have to be really attentive to when corporations are trying to move in, when they're trying to get away with not following certain kinds of our regulations around toxicity and stuff like that are not good enough, but especially when corporations can get away with not even following what actually already exists. But I also think that it's really important to think about prevention, of course, but also what we can do as as a community to really think about what these communities who already have been impacted need. And a lot of the time, I think that healthcare is the issue that continuously remains. So something like a universal healthcare could help with that sort of dynamic as well.
Yeah. So, what kind of things are we advocating for now as we talk about the work that you're doing? Let's get to the advocacy component. What are you advocating for?
Well, I think I just said one of them, universal healthcare. Certain these broad kinds of policies that could just help support communities in all sorts of ways. Could be a way of addressing these kinds of harms that come from contamination as well, right? So, but I also think that there needs to be a whole shift in the way that we're thinking about the relationship between like harm to the environment and harm to human beings. And sort of, we're so used to thinking about, environmental remediation as something that's over here, and then human health as being something that's over here in a separate arena, right? But what we see again and again, like look all around us, right? The hurricanes, the fires, all the ways in which human beings are just completely implicated, and our health is completely impacted by these dynamics. And so I think really taking climate policy seriously, right? A Green New Deal would go a long way to address so many of these issues. So, this book isn't specifically, I'm not a policy person, so I can't specifically say this and this and this. But I think that those kind of broad, really reconfigurations of the way that we're thinking about what's important in society would be would be really helpful.
I need to be transparent for a moment and say that, I'm thinking about the fact of when I think about, environmental relationships and I think about environmental injustice, it doesn't always come to mind disability, and here we are, and you're doing a great job of causing people not to rethink, but to honestly think about this. And I mean, I really had to give it some thought, particularly after I think about Flint, Michigan. I think about a lot of the disability that came out of that with people who have, complications with lead and things of that nature.
Yeah.
Same thing happening right now, in Tucson. What can we do to raise and amplify the voice? That way people can become more familiar and be able to link disability with environmental relationships.
Well, I think you're exactly right for us to just look around. Look at what's happening in Arizona right now, right, with all of the heat-related deaths. The people who are most likely to experience heat-related deaths are people who are already, have conditions, that make them more vulnerable to heat, right? And these are often the same kinds of conditions that are entangled with, other kinds of inequalities, right? So I think disability and illness are really helpful ways of trying to understand what's happening, because we care about those issues, right? We want to create or at least I hope, right, that we want a world that values and helps support, creates the conditions for disabled and ill people and communities to be able to live good lives and thrive. And the more we have these kinds of environmental intense disasters, but just also the ongoing kind of constant daily reality of heat waves and living in toxic environments, then the harder that is. So um, I think looking to communities themselves and really listening to what they need
Right.
and what they're calling for.
So, Sunaura, for people want to, put their hands on this book, Disabled Ecologies, how they go about doing that?
Well, you can get the book at anywhere books are sold, and you can learn more about me at my website, sonarataylor.net.
What do you want people to take away after reading your book?
I actually, I actually want people to be hopeful. One of the reasons why I think disability is an important lens versus, say, a lot of people write about how the planet is dying, right? Or like there's this sort of catastrophic end to nature. And the thing about disability to me is that I know that disability can be a profoundly scary and hard experience, right? But we also know from disability communities that people can make beautiful, thriving lives living with disability. And I think that sort of thriving way of living is what I'm hoping for not only disabled human communities, but for our ongoing, now our essentially disabled environments.
So, for people, they know all the platforms where books are sold. You can pretty much get in touch there. It's a great conversation. I want to thank you so much for joining us. I really enjoyed us having an opportunity to discuss about, ecological issues, because when you talk about social justice, ecological justice is tied to social justice, and
Totally.
and disabilities. Those who live in the disability in that community have to also be tied to that too. And how you've been able to really correlate the two in this conversation has given me definitely some food for thought, and say I got to bring you back. So, Sunaura, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. This was really fun. I really appreciate it.
Glad to have you. Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right, listen, we're taking a quick break. We got more coming up right after this.